everyone, Christina here. Welcome to day 16 of the holiday card series for 2017. Today I'm creating a Hanukkah card and I'm going to be using a greeting from the Love and Light stamp set from Altenew. And then I'm going to be creating the 9 candles of the menorah using the basic stripes from Simon Says Stamp and a petal shape from this Birthday Wishes stamp set. I thought it'd be kind of fun to create a more modern look for the candles, so I'm making those out of a stripe and a petal shape. Starting out with some navy cardstock, and I'm using this in my MISTI tool. I've put down some anti-static powder to prevent any embossing powder from going places where I don't want it. And then I'm stamping my greeting in Versamark ink. I'm going to coat this in some sterling embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, and then heat set this with a heat tool until it's smooth and melted. Now, eventually I will be covering up this area with a strip of vellum with the same sentiment on top, but at this point I didn't know how exactly the card was going to go, and I thought I might leave that greeting where it's at. Either way, I needed to have the spacing just right so that I could stamp all of my candles. So to start out all of the candles, I'm beginning with the flame shape or the petal shape in the center kind of top area of the card. The center candle is slightly taller than the other 4 on each side. So I did end up stamping those 4 just with a block. It's a little bit easier to move them along the line that way. So after I stamped all of them, I coated them in alabaster embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. This is the white embossing powder, and they somehow kind of got everywhere, all the embossing powder, so I did clean it up with a dry paintbrush, and that just sweeps away any of the embossing powder that's in places where I don't want it. And then heat set that with my heat tool until all of them were smooth and melted. So I'm going to create sort of like a glow behind all of these candle flames. So I'm using some fossilized amber distress oxide ink and also a sponge dauber. And I'm just sort of blending in circular motions around each one of these flames. And this is going to give a nice yellow glow to both the cardstock around the flames, and it's also going to color the white embossing powder just a little bit. Distress oxide ink is sort of a hybrid of dye ink and pigment ink, so it's a little bit thicker than regular dye ink, and it won't slide off the embossing powder like dye ink would. So I kind of liked that idea. So now I'm using one of the stripes from that basic stripe stamp set, and I'm going to stamp each one of these in white pigment ink from Simon Says Stamp. And I knew that this white pigment ink wasn't going to be completely white. I knew it would allow some of that navy cardstock underneath to show through and sort of create a pale blue color. I thought that would be really, really pretty. Now, if you wanted to do this and make sure that the candles are completely white, you could definitely stamp this in Versamark and then put white embossing powder over the top. That's what I would suggest, or what I would do if I wanted a really stark white color. There's not really a really good white ink out there that will give you a completely opaque white stamped image. Unfortunately, there's just not one that will do that. So whenever I want something that's super white, I always end up heat embossing it. So I stamped all 9 of the candles, and at this point I realized that that greeting was much too small and needed something a little wider. So I thought I would cover up that area with a wide strip of vellum that has the greeting stamped on top. So I did the same process I did before. I stamped it in Versamark, put the sterling embossing powder on top, and then heat embossed it until it was smooth and melted. I then trimmed down the vellum piece, and this is some 40-pound vellum from Basil, by the way. This is a nice heavyweight vellum. And then I kind of tested it out to see if my idea would work, and it worked great. It goes right over the top of that previous embossing, and you can hardly see it underneath. To make that area even wider, I cut off some very narrow strips of cardstock, and I'm going to coat these in that same sterling embossing powder, that silver embossing powder. So I'm coating each one of these strips in Versamark, and then I'm going to pick it up with some tweezers, and I'm going to hold it with the tweezers while I apply the embossing powder. And this is the same method I used in one of my previous holiday card series videos, where I first emboss it holding the tweezers. I'll just bring my heat tool over and heat set that until it's completely melted. And then I'm going to let it cool for just a minute or two and move the tweezers to a different area. You can see there's that white spot where it was the tweezers were holding the cardstock. Then going to coat that in the silver embossing powder, and that will just fill in that white gap where the tweezers were holding the cardstock. So I did that for both of the very narrow strips of cardstock. And then I grabbed my vellum stamped piece and placed that over the top and wrapped the edges and folded the vellum. Wanted to make sure this was in precisely the best spot to cover up the previous area below, and I need to have that folded before I adhered it. I then grabbed some Tombow Extreme adhesive and put the adhesive on the back of the vellum so that when I press it down onto the cardstock and wrap it around the edges, it will stay in place. So I'm going to make sure I have that in the right spot, and then I'll go ahead and wrap the vellum strip around my navy cardstock. And that's going to hold this vellum in place. I want this super tight so that it's not bowing up from the surface of the cardstock too much. I then grabbed some Ranger Multimedia Matte Adhesive and put down a really thin strip of adhesive right below the vellum area. And my bottle of Ranger Multimedia Matte might look a little strange. That's because I've transferred all of that adhesive into a separate bottle. This is a Quilt Precision Tip bottle. It has a nice narrow point on the bottle so I can have a really small application, really precise application. I then pressed down that little strip of silver embossing, and I'm going to use my scissors to trim off the end. You could also apply the adhesive directly to the strip. That's what I did in this case, and then it just held it with my tweezers while I got it in place. This one was a little bit easier just because I didn't have any excess adhesive hanging out. I'll trim off the end, and I'm almost done. I'm just going to assemble the card, the last few stages. So I'm scoring my card base at 5.5 to create a top folding card, and then I put some foam adhesive on the back of my stamped piece, and I'll place that down onto the card front. And my cardstock for the card base today is some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White in the 110-pound version. And that is the card for today. Hope you guys enjoyed this Hanukkah card. I don't think I've ever done a Hanukkah card in a holiday card series, and it was about time because there are a lot of different holidays that we celebrate around this time of year. Thanks so much for watching. I will be back on Friday for day 17 of the holiday card series. Thanks for watching.